Number 1. This is the first and possibly the last time I post something like this on this site. I don't know who to talk to anymore. Below is the biggest mistake I've ever made. When we were 16, my best friend and I decided to explore an abandoned house that was about 2 to 3 blocks away from his. We had intentionally chosen to visit the house in the middle of the night. I told my parents that I would be at his house, and he had told his parents that he would be at mine, something we did regularly. So, we just grabbed 2 flashlights and started the 5-minute walk to the house. At first, when we got there, it seemed rather uneventful and pretty much lame. It was obvious that we were not the first to visit the house, as all 3 floors had signs of wear and tear. Debris covered the floors and the walls were filled with holes and torn wallpaper. Soon, we ended up on the 3rd floor, and as we explored, we split up, each entering different rooms. I chose the first room in the hall, while he went into the room opposite of mine. It was a nondescript bedroom. It had a single bed with a drawer. I started to look around for anything interesting, but suddenly, I heard my friend calmly calling my name. I started heading towards the door, annoyed, but before I could ask him what he wanted, he rushed into the room, placed his hands over my mouth, and whispered for me to be quiet because the voice calling my name wasn't him. Initially skeptical, thinking he was fucking with me, I went to grab his hand and tell him that he was, in fact, not funny. But when I heard the same voice, his voice, calling my name again, even though my friend was right in front of me, my belief in his seriousness solidified. No one else knew about us visiting the house that night, so it couldn't have been any of our stupid friends playing a prank on us. I've never felt such fear before. It was as if I had died. I felt my heart stop, and a sudden feeling of dizziness made me feel like I wanted to throw up. We ran and hid next to the bed for what felt like hours, though it was probably closer to 20 to 30 minutes. Eventually, we managed to gather up enough courage to try and escape. We started going down the stairs, trying to make our way out of that fucking house. When we reached the 2nd floor, however, we once again heard that fucking voice. A voice that I wish I could hear again, even though it's responsible for my friend's disappearance. I'm ashamed to admit it, but panic overcame me, and I started running. In the chaos, I dropped my flashlight, and guided only by the minimal moonlight, I kept running. I abandoned my best friend. I heard his voice asking for help, but it didn't stop. I never looked back. Eventually, I reached outside. I turned around, waiting for him to follow, but he never did. I waited for felt like an eternity and just prayed that he would show up, but he never came out of that house. It's been 3 years and he's still missing. The cops went to the house and found my flashlight on the 2nd floor where I originally dropped it, and my friend's flashlight in the room at the 3rd floor. Was he dragged there? Every time I lay on my bed at night, I wonder what happened to him in that house after I bailed on him. Was he kidnapped? Did he suffer? What did that thing do to him? And what was it? It's his birthday today, and I can't bear the guilt any longer. I can't face his parents anymore. His mother hasn't left the house since the day her son went missing, and his family's torn apart. There's nothing holding them together anymore. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can hear him asking for help. I can hear his voice begging for help, but I can't help him. I feel trapped. I wish we never went to that house. I'm sorry, William. Happy birthday, man. Number 2. Every time I die, I enter an alternate reality, and each fresh world is more horrifying than the last. This is likely the only existence you've ever known, but I remember a brighter life. I grew up in a warless version of the 2000s. World hunger was an ancient nightmare, a frightful fable of fictitious proportions. In the 2000s, we lived a privileged era. Our technology far exceeded anything in this reality. We had solved so many of the world's problems. Life was good. Life was super easy. But that all changed for me in 2011. Cycling along a quaint country road, a collision with a distracted driver would wrench me from my beautiful life forever. I was torn from my body. I screamed into a metaphysical abyss as my soul ascended from its mangled corpse onto the tarmac. In 2011, at the age of 18, I died. I have no doubt of that. Just as I have no doubt that looming, rotting, curling fingers emerged from the clouds to seize my spiritual form, only to be denied the pleasure as my untethered soul suddenly plummeted back to the ground. I entered oblivion, absolute darkness. And then, "Are you okay?" a man cried. My eyelids were unnaturally weighty and unwilling to open, and when I finally did part them, I found my soul back in its physical body, entangled with my bicycle on the road, my previously mangled body in seemingly pristine condition. "Can you move?" the voice continued. I didn't see you, I'm so sorry, but I died, I breathlessly croaked. The man gulped. No, you're going to be okay. I've called you an ambulance. I felt disjointed, and yet there was not a single scratch on my body. It was disjointedness of a spiritual nature, a sense of not belonging, a sense that I had unknowingly cheated the frightening fingers that were poised to scoop me from the sky. By the time the ambulance arrived, the driver had unmarried my frozen body from the bicycle wreckage. I could move, but I hadn't. Not yet. There was too much terror to process. I dreamt it, I thought. I didn't really die and leave my body. Don't be stupid. The driver, racked with guilt, followed us to the hospital. He and I seemed equally shocked by not only my survival, but my apparent lack of injuries. After undergoing various physical and psychological checks, I was giving the medical all clear, but the driver protested relentlessly. It was a head-on collision, he yelled. The kid flew into the air. You saw the wreckage. His bike is non-existent. Check again. You've missed something. A head injury. Something. One of the doctors attempted to calm him down. Mr. Dale, I appreciate your concern, but Finn has sustained no injuries. This is a good thing. Nobody's hurt. Meanwhile, I was observing the hospital environment from my bed with that returning sense of disconnectedness. Things were different. The machinery in the hospital looked less advanced. People's clothes looked dated, but it wasn't until I returned to my family that the horror truly revealed itself. As I stepped into the unfamiliar surroundings, I realized that I was not home. I've made spaghetti for dinner, Finn, Mom said. I nodded slowly, transfixed by the kitchen television. It depicted a horrifying scene of misery and destruction in the Middle East. I thought it to be a film until I saw the news logo at the bottom, and that was when I understood what I was seeing. War. Something I had only ever seen in history books. Something that the world had mostly quashed with the unification of religions and nations in the 1800s. The URN, an event that I would learn had never actually happened. Switch on to something jollier, Dave, Mom said, noticing my distress. I immediately ran to my room to research the atrocity that had evoked such a nonchalant reaction from my parents. How could they be so unfazed by what I assumed to be the first war in over a century? The surprises didn't cease there. Atop my bedroom desk, there sat a mobile phone, which looked like something from the 80s. My version of the 80s. And the internet was far more primitive than I remembered. My palms began to sweat, and that only worsened as I read about the numerous wars that had plagued the world for a century. Thankfully, some strides had been taken in resolving conflicts, and widespread hunger had been eradicated in the late 90s. But the timeline was still wrong. Terribly wrong. And this wasn't even your reality. It took years for me to adjust to a world with so many historical variations. I kept the truth a secret from family and friends. I feared that I'd be committed to a psychiatric ward if I were to reveal what really happened to me. And maybe I would have agreed. I think I might have eventually chalked it up to a mental health issue if it hadn't been for my second death. December 11th, 2022. I died in a plane crash over the English Channel in the bowels of the ocean. My disembodied spirit sank with the fragments of an aircraft's carcass and numerous ghoulish specters of deceased passengers. And from the darkened depths of that watery graveyard, I saw familiar fingers reaching toward me, as if greeting an old friend. I feared what that terrifying giant had in store for the soul that had eluded it, cheated it, and those awful appendages seemed angrier this time. But then, yet again, my soul was torn away. I rose through the water and reunited with my body at the surface. I found myself floating at sea, but there was no plane wreckage in sight, only the cliffs of Dover in the distance. And so I swam towards them. But the world I found upon reaching the shore was even more terrifyingly different from the one I had left years ago. It was your world. Everything has been corrupted here. Senseless death and destruction, a world on the brink of self-inflicted collapse, and nobody cares. The people here are shells. They terrify me. I used to fear the shadowy hand that craved and still craves my soul in all universes. Now I only fear the deeper level of horror that the next reality brings. Number 3. Midnight was beginning to roll around. I was at a club with 2 of my friends, but I guess I'm no fun at parties because they had already left me a long time ago to go drink with someone else. The party had only just started, but I wasn't feeling it at all. I looked around. Everyone was drinking, smoking, and dancing. I'm good at none of those things. I finally began to understand why I'd never been invited to these sorts of events. I'm just boring. With nothing to do, I had decided to leave early. No one would notice anyway. In a situation like this, I would usually call an Uber driver, but my phone was low on battery and there was a bus stop nearby. So, I started walking there instead. It was very cold outside. The winter had already begun and it snowed no remorse. Luckily, the bus stop was not far away, so I got there fairly quickly. Right away, I checked the timetable, and there was a bus arriving at 12:21 a.m., exactly 10 minutes later. It would drop me off close enough by my house, so I waited. 20 minutes had passed. I was getting bored by now. I had already seen a few buses, and every single one arrived on time. I was pretty surprised by how full they were, though. This late at night, I would only expect to see a few people in each bus. I continued to wait. 30 minutes. At this point, I was tired and irritated, and I would have likely just taken another bus, but then I saw a light. Finally, it had arrived. I slowly came inside. Unlike the other buses I've seen that night, this one was entirely empty, save for one elderly man. I smiled. It was a relief I wouldn't have to deal with a huge crowd again. I came up to the bus driver. "Where are you heading?" he asked me, not even looking in my direction. He sounded like your average grumpy old man. I gave him the name of my station, paid for the ticket. Not wanting to doze off, I put on my headphones and started playing some heavy metal. It was nice not to get weird looks for using an MP3 player like I usually do. As time went on, I was getting a little impatient again. I checked my watch. It was already 1:26 a.m. The old man was fast asleep. At that moment, I realized something really weird. The bus had not stopped a single time since I entered it. Maybe it actually did, and I was just too invested in my music to notice. Either way, I looked through the window, and I did not recognize any of my surroundings. Did I fuck up somewhere? Are we even on our way to my house? I was riddled with doubts. "Excuse me, when are we arriving at my station?" I hesitantly asked the bus driver. "Soon," he mumbled. He sounded angry for some reason. I made no further comments. This entire bus trip was getting really sketchy, and I just wanted to leave already. But I couldn't do anything but wait, alone with my thoughts. Why did I even go to that party again? I had no fun at all, and now I had to deal with this bullshit. If only I had decided to charge my phone beforehand. If only I had called an Uber driver. If only... The bus stopped. It was so sudden. I'm glad I had fastened my seatbelt, cause God knows what would have happened if I hadn't. After the initial shock, I looked around. Any hopes of having finally arrived were quickly diminished. All I could see through the window were trees. This was the point where fear really started kicking in. I just wanted to safely get home and forget this. Then, out of nowhere, the bus driver stood up and said, "You are at your destination." After which, he pulled out a knife. He charged at the old man and started stabbing him. Panic. I frantically began pressing the button that opens the door, but it didn't work. I dashed to the second door. It didn't open either. Panic. Looking all around me, the realization hit me that I was done for. But then, I noticed something. The glass breaker. The glass breaker, of course. Did he not think of that? I grabbed it and smashed open the window, jumped out of it, and started sprinting in a random direction. I heard a few screams and shouts, but I eventually lost them. Well, now I was in the middle of nowhere. With the 2% of battery that I had on my phone, I called the police. When they got there, a few of the cops went into the forest to look for the murderer and the body. Meanwhile, I was taken to the police department. Obviously, they interviewed me, but I didn't really have any useful information to give, aside from how the dude looked, so they let me go pretty quickly. They then finally took me home. When I came in, I immediately charged that goddamn phone, lay it on the couch, and tried my hardest to sleep. Even though my body was extremely tired, I just couldn't stop thinking about what had just gone down. As the night was coming to an end, I decided I would just go and get some coffee and take a nap during the day. I went into the kitchen and began brewing an espresso. It was just what I needed to get some necessary energy for a few hours. While preparing the drink, I looked out the window. I froze. It was that bus parking in front of my residence. I thought the cops had done something about him, but I suppose not. Strangely, it had been a few minutes and the vehicle had not moved. The driver hadn't come out either. Suddenly, I heard knocking at the front door. I didn't see anyone come out of the bus, but "It's the police. Open up," I heard from downstairs. I went down, albeit still a bit hesitant, and opened the door. "Well, we've searched the entire town here, but there's no sign of the bus to be found. We're gonna keep looking though," they said. I don't really know what I expected from them, but alas, that's what I got. As the police cars began to drive out of sight, I noticed a sticky note on the other side of the door window. Did they perhaps leave a message for me? I grabbed the note and checked it. "I'm gonna get ya," smiley face.